The morning Montana sun painted the Wilson Ranch in golden hues when Charles Henderson III made what would go down in family history as the worst first impression of his privileged life. One moment he was attempting to impress his future father-in-law by approaching what he assumed was a gentle farm cow. The next moment he was sprinting across the pasture, designer loafers slipping on morning dew, as Brutus, a 2,000-pound bull with anger management issues, thundered behind him like a furry freight train. "Holy crap, holy crap, holy crap!" Charles gasped, his Harvard MBA proving utterly useless against basic farm animal physics. Behind him, Brutus snorted with the enthusiasm of someone who'd finally found entertainment after weeks of boring pasture life. The bull wasn't actually trying to hurt anyone. He just enjoyed a good chase, especially when it involved someone wearing a suit that cost more than most people's cars. Charles spotted salvation in the form of a wooden fence ahead. Freedom was just 30 yards away, 20 yards, 10 yards. Victory was within reach when his Italian leather sole hit a particularly slippery patch of mud. Time slowed to a cinematic crawl as Charles Henderson III, heir to $800 million, graduate of the finest schools, future captain of industry, performed an Olympic-quality faceplant directly into a puddle of Montana mud that smelled suspiciously like it hadn't always been mud. Splat! The sound echoed across the ranch like a cosmic punctuation mark on the end of his dignity. From the safety of the fence line, Thomas Wilson doubled over with laughter so genuine and uncontrolled that tears streamed down his weathered face. At 58, the Wilson family patriarch had seen plenty of city slickers learn hard lessons about farm life, but this was comedy gold. "Ha ha ha! Oh, sweet mercy!" Thomas wheezed, slapping his knee. "Boy, you just got schooled by Brutus. That bull's got more sense than half the politicians in Washington." Charles lifted his mud-caked face from the ground, spitting out what he desperately hoped was just dirt. His $500 haircut now resembled a wet mop, and his custom suit looked like it had lost a fight with a chocolate cake factory. Is he going to charge again?" Charles asked weakly, eyeing Brutus, who had lost interest and was now contentedly chewing grass like nothing had happened. "Nah, he's done with you. Brutus is like my late wife. Once he's made his point, he moves on to more important things." Thomas extended a calloused hand to help Charles up. "Course, you probably shouldn't have tried to pet him. City folks always think farm animals are like golden retrievers." Charles accepted the help, struggling to his feet while mud dripped from every surface of his formerly pristine appearance. "Your daughter's going to take one look at me and call off this whole arrangement." "Oh, I wouldn't worry about that," Thomas said, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Sarah May's seen worse. Besides, a little mud builds character. Speaking of which, Sarah May, come meet your future husband." "Dad, no!" a voice called from the direction of the farmhouse. "I told you I'm not meeting anyone until I finish mucking the stalls." "Too late for that, sweetheart. He's already been mucked for you." Charles turned toward the voice and immediately understood why his father had chosen Sarah May Wilson. She emerged from the barn like something out of a country music video. Golden hair caught up in a practical ponytail, work clothes that somehow made her look effortlessly beautiful, and boots that had clearly seen real work. She was stunning in a way that made magazine models look artificial, but it was her expression when she saw him that made Charles's heart skip. Not with attraction, but with the dawning realization that she looked absolutely horrified. "Oh no, oh no, no, no." Sarah May approached like someone identifying a traffic accident. "You're him, aren't you? The arranged husband?" "Charles Henderson III, he said, extending a muddy hand before thinking better of it. "Though I'm not exactly making the best first impression. That's an understatement." Sarah May crossed her arms, studying him like a particularly disappointing science experiment. "Dad, what did you do?" "I didn't do nothing. Boy decided to make friends with Brutus all on his own. I was just enjoying the show. You let him walk into a pasture with an aggressive bull. Brutus ain't aggressive, he's just playful. Besides, city boy needs to learn ranch life if he's going to be part of this family." Charles cleared his throat, still dripping. "About that arrangement, we need to talk," Sarah May said firmly. "Privately. Dad, go find him some clean clothes. He smells like he lost a fight with our septic system." "That's not entirely inaccurate," Charles muttered, following Sarah May toward a picnic table under a massive oak tree. Sarah May sat down and fixed him with the kind of direct stare that made Charles understand why she'd turned down 3 previous suitors. This was not a woman who was easily impressed by money or status. "So," she said, "your father arranged this whole thing behind your back too? You mean you didn't agree to this? Are you kidding? I found out yesterday when Dad told me to put on a dress because my future husband was coming for breakfast. I thought he was joking until your fancy plane landed at our little airstrip." Charles felt a strange sense of relief. "So we're both victims of parental manipulation. Looks like it. Though I have to say your victim status is definitely more aromatic than mine." Despite everything, Charles laughed. It was the first genuine laugh he'd had since his father's announcement. "This is insane. Our parents are treating us like we're characters in some 19th century novel." "Welcome to traditional family values," Sarah May said dryly. "My dad's been trying to marry me off for years. Says I'm too independent for my own good and need a husband to settle me down. And my father thinks marriage should be a strategic business merger. Love is apparently a luxury we can't afford." "Well, that's depressing." Sarah May studied him with new interest. "So what do we do about it?" "I have no idea. Run away? Join the circus? Fake our own deaths? Tempting, but impractical. We'd never make it as circus performers. You just proved you can't handle farm animals, and I'm afraid of heights." Charles found himself genuinely smiling for the first time in days. "You know, you're nothing like I expected. Let me guess. You expected some simpering farm girl who'd be thrilled to marry into money. Something like that. Sorry to disappoint. I have a degree in agricultural science. I run the technical side of our farming operation, and I once punched a state senator who grabbed my butt at a fundraiser." "You punched a senator?" "Made the local news. Dad was so proud he framed the newspaper article." Sarah May's expression grew serious. "Look, Charles, can I call you Charles? I'm not looking for a husband, especially not one chosen by committee. But our families have apparently decided this is happening whether we like it or not. So what do you suggest? We play along for now. Give them what they expect while we figure out how to get out of this mess without destroying our families in the process." Charles nodded, appreciating her practical approach. "Like a strategic partnership." "Exactly. We pretend to be the perfect arranged couple while secretly planning our escape. Think you can handle that?" "I think I can manage that better than I managed Brutus. That's not a high bar, but I'll take it." Sarah May stood up, brushing off her jeans. "First rule, no trying to impress me with your money. I'm not interested in your trust fund or your family's business empire." "Fair enough. What are you interested in?" "Honest conversation, genuine laughter, and maybe someone who won't run screaming when they see what real farm work looks like." She looked him up and down, taking in his muddy disaster of an appearance. "Though judging by your current state, you might not survive the full ranch experience. I'm tougher than I look." "You'd have to be." From the farmhouse porch, Thomas Wilson watched his daughter and the Henderson boy talking. They were smiling. That was a good sign. Of course, he hadn't told Sarah May about the other part of his plan, the part that involved making sure this city boy either proved himself worthy of his daughter or got scared off before any real damage was done. Thomas had been planning little tests ever since Charles Henderson Sr. had proposed this arrangement. The bull encounter had been just the beginning. He had a whole week's worth of challenges lined up, each one designed to show whether this rich boy had any real character underneath all that privilege. What Thomas didn't know was that someone else had been making plans too. Buck Martinez had arrived at the Wilson Ranch 2 hours before the Henderson party, having driven through the night to get there first. He'd spent those 2 hours getting acquainted with the ranch hands and learning everything he could about the Wilson family dynamics. Buck had also met Sarah May during his reconnaissance mission, and he'd liked her immediately. She had the kind of sharp wit and independent spirit that would be perfect for Charles, if they could just get past all the family pressure and expectations. Now Buck was hidden in the barn, listening to Charles and Sarah May's conversation and grinning to himself. This was going to be even better than he'd hoped. Both kids were smart enough to see through their parents' schemes, which meant they were smart enough to appreciate some well-intentioned sabotage. The question was, should he help them fall in love or help them escape? Buck decided he'd play it by ear. Either way, the next week was going to be absolutely hilarious. "Charles," Thomas called from the porch. "Come get cleaned up, son. We've got work to do." Charles stood up, still dripping but somehow feeling more optimistic than he had since this whole mess started. "Well, Sarah May, I guess this is where I try to prove I'm not completely useless. Good luck with that. And Charles? Try to avoid the livestock from now on. We've got geese that are even meaner than Brutus. Geese? Attack geese. Dad trained them to guard the chicken coop. They've sent 3 delivery guys to the emergency room. Charles stared at her. You're joking. I never joke about attack geese. As Charles walked toward the farmhouse, still processing the reality of weaponized poultry, Sarah May allowed herself a small smile. Maybe this week wouldn't be completely terrible after all. The Henderson boy was obviously out of his element, but he had a sense of humor about it. That counted for something. Plus, watching him try to survive a week of ranch life was going to be absolutely hilarious. Her father might think he was testing Charles's character, but Sarah May had her own plans. If Charles Henderson III wanted to marry into the Wilson family, he was going to have to prove he could handle more than just board meetings and trust fund management. From the barn, Buck watched the whole scene unfold and made mental notes. Thomas Wilson wanted to test Charles. Sarah May wanted to challenge him. Charles just wanted to survive with his dignity intact. This was going to be the most entertaining week of Buck's life. All he had to do was make sure everyone got exactly what they deserved, which might not be exactly what they thought they wanted. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the fun was just beginning. In a week, either Charles Henderson III would be engaged to Sarah May Wilson, or they'd both be free to pursue their own destinies. Buck Martinez was going to make sure it was the right choice, even if he had to sabotage everyone's carefully laid plans to make it happen. After all, the best love stories always started with a little chaos, and Buck was an expert at creative chaos. The morning sun climbed higher over the Wilson Ranch as Charles Henderson III prepared to discover just how much character building 1 week could contain. He had no idea that the bull encounter would be remembered as the easy part. But that's another story for another day. The Wilson Ranch house smelled like bacon, coffee, and the kind of home-cooked breakfast that made Charles realize he'd been living on overpriced cafe food his entire adult life. After cleaning off 3 layers of Montana mud and borrowing clothes from Thomas Wilson's closet, a flannel shirt that hung loose on his frame, and jeans that were definitely pre-faded the hard way, Charles felt like he was wearing a costume for a role he'd never auditioned for. Well, look what the cat dragged in, Thomas boomed as Charles entered the kitchen. You clean up pretty decent for a city boy. Of course, that bar was set pretty low after your mud wrestling match with Brutus. Sarah May looked up from her plate of eggs and couldn't help but smile. Charles Henderson III in borrowed ranch clothes was like watching a Ferrari trying to blend in at a pickup truck rally. Technically possible, but obviously out of place. Those clothes actually fit you better than that fancy suit, she said, passing him a plate piled high with more food than he typically ate in 2 days. You looked like you were wearing a straitjacket made of money. Thanks, I think. Charles sat down gingerly, still feeling the effects of his earlier encounter with the ground. This smells incredible, Mrs. Just call me Martha, hun, said Thomas's sister, a round woman with flour permanently embedded under her fingernails and the kind of warm smile that made strangers feel like family. I've been cooking for this ranch for 20 years, ever since my dear brother here burned water trying to make coffee. I did not burn water, Thomas protested. I just over-evaporated it. You set the kitchen on fire trying to boil an egg, Sarah May added helpfully. The fire department still talks about it. Charles nearly choked on his orange juice. You set the kitchen on fire making eggs? It was a learning experience, Thomas said with wounded dignity. Besides, that's what insurance is for. From the mudroom adjacent to the kitchen, Buck Martinez listened to the breakfast conversation while pretending to organize farming equipment. He'd been up since 4 a.m., preparing for what he privately called Operation Reality Check, a carefully orchestrated series of challenges designed to test whether Charles Henderson III had any character buried under all that privilege. Buck had spent the early morning hours strategically placing obstacles throughout the ranch. Nothing dangerous, mind you, just enough to ensure that Charles's agricultural education would be thorough, memorable, and absolutely hilarious. So, Charles, Thomas said, cutting into a stack of pancakes that could feed a small army. Sarah May tells me you want to learn about ranch life. That true? Charles glanced at Sarah May, who raised an eyebrow in a way that clearly said, Your move, city boy. Their conversation by the oak tree had established their alliance, but now they had to perform their parts convincingly. Absolutely, sir. I figure if I'm going to be part of this family, I should understand how the business works. It's not just a business, son. It's a way of life. We get up before dawn, work until after sunset, and every day brings something new to test your character. Thomas leaned back in his chair. Course, most folks from your background don't last more than a day or two. Dad, Sarah May warned, recognizing the gleam in her father's eyes. What? I'm just being honest. Remember that petroleum executive who came courting you last year? Started crying when he saw a chicken lay an egg. To be fair, Martha interjected, he thought chickens laid eggs like birds had babies. The biology lesson was a bit much for his delicate constitution. Charles felt a competitive spark ignite. These people clearly expected him to fail, and while part of him wanted to escape this entire situation, another part, the part that had driven him to excel at Harvard despite his father's connections, refused to back down from a challenge. Well, I'm tougher than I look, Charles said, echoing his words to Sarah May. What do you need me to do? Thomas's grin widened. Sarah May, why don't you give our guests the full ranch tour? Start with the chicken coop, then the pig pen, and finish up with hay baling in the north field. Dad, it's his first day. Maybe we should ease him into… Nonsense. Best way to learn to swim is to jump in the deep end. Besides, I want to see what this boy's made of. Sarah May looked at Charles with something that might have been sympathy. Are you sure about this? I could show you the books instead. Explain the business side of things. No, I want the full experience. Charles stood up, trying to project more confidence than he felt. How hard can farm work be? The kitchen fell silent. Even Martha stopped washing dishes. Thomas and Sarah May exchanged a look that clearly said, he did not just ask that question. Oh boy, Martha muttered. Famous last words. All right then, Sarah May said, standing up with the decisive movement of someone about to administer tough love. Let's go meet the chickens. Fair warning, they're not as friendly as Brutus. Great. Attack chickens to go with the attacked geese. The geese are just territorial. The chickens are actually malicious. Charles followed Sarah May out of the kitchen, missing the satisfied smile that crossed Thomas Wilson's face. In the mudroom, Buck Martinez quietly gathered his supplies and slipped out the back door. It was time to put his plan into motion. The Wilson Ranch chicken coop was a sprawling structure that housed about 200 birds of various temperaments, most of them bad. As Sarah May led Charles through the gate, the assembled chickens turned to regard him with the collective intelligence of a very small, very angry mob. So, Sarah May said, handing him a basket, we need to collect the eggs. Simple enough? Just reach under the hens and grab whatever you find. That doesn't sound too complicated. Famous last words number 2, Sarah May murmured. Meet Henrietta, our head hen. She's the one with the attitude problem. Henrietta was a massive Rhode Island red who looked like she'd been hitting the chicken gym. She fixed Charles with a stare that suggested she'd been waiting her entire life for this moment. She doesn't look that intimidating, Charles said, approaching the nesting boxes. Henrietta, play nice, Sarah May called out, but there was laughter in her voice. Charles reached toward the first nesting box, and Henrietta made a sound that was part cluck, part battle cry. Before he could react, she launched herself at his hand with the fury of a feathered missile. Ah! Charles yanked his hand back, stumbling backward into a feeding trough and sending chicken feed flying everywhere. She attacked me. She's just protecting her eggs, Sarah May said, though she was clearly struggling not to laugh. You have to show confidence. Chickens can smell fear. Chickens can smell fear? I might be making that up, but they definitely respond to confidence. Charles steadied himself and approached Henrietta again, this time with what he hoped looked like authority. Okay, Henrietta. We're going to do this the easy way. Henrietta cocked her head, apparently considering his proposal. Then she pecked him directly on the knuckle. Ow, this chicken is a sociopath. She's just spirited. Here, let me show you. Sarah May stepped forward and smoothly reached under Henrietta, retrieving 3 brown eggs without incident. See? It's all about technique and timing. And apparently having the right DNA. I'm pretty sure she likes you better than me. Most animals do. I think it's because I don't walk around smelling like expensive cologne and existential dread. Charles paused. I smell like existential dread. A little bit. It's subtle, but it's there. Despite everything, Charles found himself laughing. Great. I'm being psychoanalyzed by a farm girl and attacked by a chicken. This day just keeps getting better. What Charles didn't see was Buck Martinez, hidden behind the feed storage, carefully adjusting the latch on the chicken coop gate. When they finished collecting eggs and moved on to the next challenge, that gate would be just loose enough to create an interesting surprise later. The pig pen was their next destination, and Charles approached it with the wariness of someone who'd already been outsmarted by farm animals twice in one morning. The Wilson pigs were enormous creatures that looked like they'd been eating well and enjoying life. "Meat bacon, pork chop, and sausage," Sarah May said, pointing to 3 particularly large specimens. "Dad named them. He thinks it's funny. That's a little dark, isn't it? That's farm life. We love our animals, but we're also realistic about their purpose. These 3 are actually retired breeders, so they're just living the good life now. Retired pigs. That's something you don't hear every day. They've earned it. Pork Chop here has fathered about 60 piglets over the years. He's like the Hugh Hefner of the pig world." Charles watched as Pork Chop rolled contentedly in the mud. He does look pretty satisfied with life. "Your job is to clean their pen and refill their water. Think you can handle that without getting mauled?" "I'm starting to question everything I thought I knew about farm animals, but sure. How dangerous can pigs be?" Sarah May bit her lip to keep from smiling. Famous last words number 3. "You really need to stop saying things like that." Charles grabbed a shovel and approached the pen with determination. This time, he was going to prove that a Harvard MBA could handle basic manual labor. What he didn't know was that Buck had strategically weakened the hose connection to the water trough, timing it perfectly for maximum comedic effect. Charles began shoveling with more enthusiasm than technique, sending mud flying in directions he hadn't intended. The pigs watched with interest, apparently entertained by the free show. "You might want to pace yourself," Sarah May called out. "It's going to be a long day." "I've got this," Charles replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "Just need to get into a rhythm." That's when he decided to refill the water trough. Charles grabbed the hose, turned on the water, and immediately discovered that water pressure plus a loose connection equals a very wet, very surprised city boy. The hose exploded from the connection with the force of a small geyser, drenching Charles from head to toe and turning the pig pen into an impromptu slip and slide. Charles tried to grab the runaway hose, slipped in the resulting mud, and landed flat on his back, while the hose continued to spray water everywhere like a demented sprinkler system. The pigs, delighted by this unexpected entertainment, began rolling around in the fresh mud with obvious joy. Pork Chop actually seemed to be laughing, if pigs could laugh. Sarah May rushed over to turn off the water, but not before Charles had been thoroughly soaked, muddied, and humbled for the second time that morning. "Are you okay?" she asked, extending a hand to help him up. "I'm starting to think your ranch has it out for me," Charles said, accepting her help and trying to wring mud out of his borrowed shirt. "First the bull, then the chicken, now the plumbing. It's like the universe is conspiring against me." "Maybe it's just testing you," Sarah May said, and there was something in her voice that made Charles look at her more closely. "Testing me for what?" "To see if you're the kind of person who gives up when things get difficult, or if you're willing to keep trying even when you're covered in mud and pig water." Charles considered this, standing there dripping and ridiculous in the middle of a pig pen. "And what's your assessment so far? You're still here, aren't you?" From his hiding spot behind the barn, Buck watched the exchange and felt a warm sense of satisfaction. The hose trick had worked perfectly, but more importantly, Charles was showing exactly the kind of character Buck had hoped to see. The kid was getting knocked down repeatedly, but he kept getting back up with his sense of humor intact. Even better, Sarah May was starting to look at Charles with something that might be respect. She'd expected him to quit after the first disaster, but he was proving tougher than his expensive clothes suggested. Buck made a mental note to dial back the sabotage just a little. The goal was to build character, not break spirits. Besides, he was starting to like the idea of these 2 kids actually falling for each other. "Come on," Sarah May said, leading Charles toward the barn. "Let's get you cleaned up before lunch. Again. Is the rest of the day going to be like this? Probably worse. This afternoon Dad wants you to help with hay baling. What could possibly go wrong with hay baling?" Sarah May stopped walking and stared at him. Please tell me you didn't just ask that question. I think I'm starting to understand the pattern here." "Good. You're learning. Maybe there's hope for you after all." As they walked toward the barn, Charles found himself stealing glances at Sarah May. Covered in mud and pig water, he should have felt embarrassed and defeated. Instead, he felt oddly exhilarated. For the first time in his life, He was being challenged by something that couldn't be solved with money or connections. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. Sarah May, meanwhile, was discovering that watching Charles Henderson III get repeatedly humbled by farm life was more entertaining than she'd expected. But what surprised her was that he kept bouncing back with genuine good humor. Most of the wealthy men her father had tried to set her up with would have been calling for their lawyers by now. "Charles? Yeah? You know you don't have to prove anything to me, right? This whole arrangement was our parents' idea, not ours. I know. But maybe I need to prove something to myself." Sarah May nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Sometimes the most important challenges were the ones you chose for yourself, even when they seemed impossible. Especially when they seemed impossible. The afternoon promised to bring new adventures, new disasters, and quite possibly the beginning of something neither of them had expected when they'd formed their strategic alliance that morning. Buck Martinez was already planning the hay-baling surprise, and it was going to be his masterpiece. After all, the best love stories always included a little creative chaos, and Buck was just getting started. The afternoon sun blazed over the Wilson Ranch as Charles Henderson III stood in the north field, staring at what appeared to be a mechanical monster designed by someone with a grudge against city folk. The hay baler looked like it had been assembled from spare tractor parts, agricultural wishful thinking, and at least 3 different decades of farming technology. "She's a beauty, ain't she?" Thomas Wilson said proudly, patting the rusty beast like it was a beloved pet. "Been in the family for 30 years. Built her myself from parts I found at farm auctions. It looks like it could either bale hay or launch into orbit," Charles said, wiping sweat from his forehead. After his 3rd wardrobe change of the day, this time into clothes that Martha had diplomatically described as expendable, he was beginning to understand why ranch hands always looked weathered. "That's the spirit," Thomas laughed. "Now, the key to hay baling is timing, technique, and not getting tangled up in the machinery. Sarah May, you want to show him the ropes?" Sarah May emerged from behind the tractor, wearing work gloves, and the expression that suggested she was either looking forward to this or planning Charles's agricultural funeral. "The good news is hay baling is pretty straightforward. The bad news is everything that can go wrong usually does." "Famous last words number 4? Charles asked hopefully. "Oh no, this time I'm being completely serious. This machine has a personality disorder and a vendetta against beginners." Sarah May climbed onto the tractor seat with the easy grace of someone who'd been doing this since childhood. "Your job is to walk behind the baler, make sure the hay feeds properly, and shout if anything goes sideways. Define goes sideways. You'll know it when you see it. Trust me." What Charles didn't know was that Buck Martinez had spent his lunch break performing what he generously called preventive maintenance on the hay baler. Nothing dangerous, of course. Buck wasn't trying to hurt anyone. He'd simply adjusted a few tension springs, loosened a couple of bolts just enough to create interesting malfunctions, and rigged a small surprise that would activate at exactly the right moment. Buck was currently positioned behind a nearby oak tree, armed with binoculars and a level of anticipation usually reserved for championship football games. This was going to be his masterpiece of agricultural sabotage. "All right, Charles," Sarah May called from the tractor. "I'm going to start her up. Just follow behind and keep an eye on the hay feed. If it starts bunching up, give me a shout." The tractor roared to life with the confidence of machinery that had survived 3 decades through pure stubbornness. Charles took his position behind the baler, feeling like he was about to participate in some ancient farming ritual that he didn't fully understand. For the first 50 yards, everything went perfectly. The machine cut hay, rolled it into neat cylindrical bales, and deposited them in orderly rows. Charles began to think that maybe, finally, he'd found a farm task that wouldn't end in humiliation. That's when Buck's carefully planned sabotage kicked in. It started with a small vibration in the baler mechanism, barely noticeable at first, but gradually building to an ominous rattling that suggested the machine was either developing character or falling apart. Charles noticed the sound, but didn't immediately recognize it as a warning sign. "Sarah May!" he called out. "I think something's—" That's when the tension spring that Buck had strategically loosened finally gave way. The hay baler didn't just malfunction, it experienced what could only be described as a mechanical nervous breakdown. Hay began shooting out in random directions like confetti at a very messy party. The feed mechanism started hiccuping, creating bales that looked more like abstract art than anything useful for feeding livestock. "Sarah May!" Charles shouted, jumping backward as a particularly aggressive stream of hay shot past his head. "Something's definitely going sideways." Sarah May immediately cut the engine, but not before the baler's grand finale, a spectacular explosion of hay that covered Charles from head to toe in golden stalks, making him look like a scarecrow that had lost a fight with a tornado. "Oh my gosh!" Sarah May jumped down from the tractor, rushing toward Charles, who was standing perfectly still in the middle of a hay hurricane. "Are you hurt?" "I don't think so," Charles said carefully, afraid to move in case more hay was lurking somewhere, waiting to attack. "But I think your hay baler just declared war on me personally." Sarah May began picking hay out of his hair, trying not to laugh at the sight of a multimillionaire who looked like he'd been attacked by a very enthusiastic scarecrow factory. "This has never happened before. I mean, the balers had hiccups, but nothing like this." "Maybe I'm cursed," Charles suggested. "Maybe I'm the agricultural equivalent of a walking disaster zone. Or maybe—" Sarah May paused, a suspicious look crossing her face. She walked over to examine the baler more closely, running her hands along the mechanism that had just malfunctioned so spectacularly. "What is it?" Charles asked, shaking hay out of his borrowed shirt. "This tension spring didn't break naturally. Look. The metal's not fatigued. There's no rust damage. Someone loosened this deliberately." Charles stared at her. "You mean someone sabotaged the hay baler?" "It looks like it. But who would—" Sarah May's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Dad, your father sabotaged his own equipment. He's been doing this all day. The bull encounter, the chicken coop gate that I noticed was loose when we left, the hose connection that just happened to fail at exactly the wrong moment." Sarah May's voice rose with indignation. "He's been setting you up!" From behind his oak tree, Buck Martinez winced. Sarah May Wilson was clearly too smart for her own good. He'd been hoping to stay invisible for at least another day or two. "Why would your father want to sabotage me?" Charles asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. "Because he doesn't think you're good enough for me. This whole week is one big test to see if you'll crack under pressure, or prove that you have real character." Sarah May looked genuinely angry. "I can't believe he's been manipulating this whole situation." "To be fair," Charles said thoughtfully, "I have been proving that I can take a beating and keep coming back for more. Maybe that was the point." "That doesn't make it right. You could have been seriously hurt." Charles found himself oddly touched by her concern. "But I wasn't hurt. Bruised, muddy, soaked, covered in hay, and probably traumatized by hostile farm animals, but not actually injured. That's not the point. Actually, maybe it is the point." Charles began brushing hay off his clothes with systematic determination. "Your father wants to know if I'm tough enough for ranch life. Well, I'm still here, aren't I?" Sarah May stared at him. "You're not angry?" "Oh, I'm definitely annoyed, but I'm also starting to understand something." Charles looked around at the ranch, the endless fields, the sturdy buildings, the sense of solid purpose that permeated everything. "This isn't just about testing me. This is about protecting what your family has built." "Charles, no, hear me out. Your father has spent his whole life building this ranch, raising you to be strong and independent. Then some rich stranger shows up talking about marriage, and your dad's supposed to just hand over his daughter without making sure I'm worthy of her." Sarah May felt something shift in her chest, a warmth she hadn't expected. "So, what are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe your father is right to test me. Maybe I need to prove that I'm more than just a trust fund with good hair." "Your hair's not that good," Sarah May said automatically, then immediately blushed. "I mean, it's okay. After today, I'm pretty sure my hair has PTSD, despite everything." Sarah May laughed. "You know what? You're absolutely insane. Probably. But I'm also not quitting." That's when they heard slow clapping from behind the oak tree. Buck Martinez emerged from his hiding spot, applauding with genuine appreciation. "Well, I'll be damned," Buck said, walking toward them with a huge grin. "That was even better than I hoped." "Buck?" Charles stared at the familiar figure. "What are you doing here?" "Oh, I drove up last night. Figured you might need some moral support during your agricultural education." Buck's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Though I have to admit, I might have contributed to some of your educational experiences." "You?" Sarah May's eyes narrowed. "You're the saboteur?" "Guilty as charged. Though in my defense, I was just helping Thomas give you the full ranch experience. Plus, I wanted to see what our boy Charles here was made of." Our boy, Charles sputtered. Buck, you've been working for my family for 15 years. Exactly. Which means I've watched you grow up, and I wanted to make sure you didn't embarrass the Henderson name by folding at the first sign of real work. Buck looked genuinely proud. I'm happy to report that you passed with flying colors. Literally, in the case of that hay explosion. Sarah May looked back and forth between Charles and Buck, processing this new information. So you two know each other? Buck's been like a second father to me, Charles said. He's the one who taught me how to change a tire, how to throw a punch, and how to tell when adults are full of crap. Which brings us to the current situation, Buck said meaningfully. Charles, your daddy sent me up here to keep an eye on you and report back on how things go with Miss Sarah May. But I'm thinking, maybe it's time I started working for you instead of reporting on you. What do you mean? I mean, maybe it's time you started making your own decisions about your life, instead of letting your old man arrange everything for you. Charles felt something crystallize in his mind, a sense of clarity he'd been missing since this whole arranged marriage mess began. You're right. I'm tired of being a passenger in my own life. Good, Buck said, because I've got a proposition for both of you. Sarah May crossed her arms, still covered in hay and looking skeptical. I'm listening. What if instead of fighting this arrangement, you two took control of it? What if you decided to get to know each other on your own terms, without all the family pressure and expectations? You mean actually try to make this work? Charles asked. I mean, stop letting other people write your story. You're both smart, decent people who got thrown into an impossible situation. But maybe, just maybe, there's something here worth exploring. Sarah May studied Charles, really looked at him for the first time all day. Covered in hay, sweaty from honest work, and still standing despite everything the ranch had thrown at him. He looked different, less like a privileged prince and more like someone she might actually want to get to know. What did you have in mind? She asked quietly. Buck's grin widened. How about we give your families exactly what they want? A perfect courtship and engagement, while you two figure out if you actually like each other. You want us to fake the perfect romance? Charles asked. I want you to have the space to discover if it might be real. Charles and Sarah May looked at each other, and for the first time since this whole mess began, they saw possibility instead of obligation. There's just one problem, Sarah May said. My father's going to keep testing Charles until he either proves himself or breaks. Leave Thomas to me, Buck said with a wicked grin. I think it's time I had a heart-to-heart with him about his testing methods. Plus, I've got a few ideas about how to turn the tables on him. You're going to sabotage the saboteur? Charles asked. Kid, I've been perfecting the art of creative chaos for longer than you've been alive. Thomas Wilson is about to discover that two can play the farm life education game. As the afternoon sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the ranch in shades of gold and amber, Charles Henderson III made a decision that would have shocked his father and delighted his mother. He was going to stop trying to escape this situation and start trying to make it work. Sarah May Wilson, watching this wealthy stranger who'd been battered by farm life all day, but still managed to find humor in everything, made a decision of her own. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to Charles Henderson than expensive suits and inherited privilege. And Buck Martinez, satisfied that his agricultural education program had achieved its desired results, began planning the most elaborate and entertaining courtship sabotage in Montana ranch history. After all, the best love stories always began with a little creative chaos. And Buck was just getting warmed up. The real adventure was about to begin. Thomas Wilson, watching from the farmhouse porch, had no idea that his carefully orchestrated character tests were about to become the least of his worries. Buck Martinez was coming for him, and when Buck decided to teach someone a lesson about manipulation, the education was always memorable. The stage was set for a battle of wits between two master saboteurs, with the future happiness of two young people hanging in the balance. This was going to be fun. Dawn broke over the Wilson Ranch with the kind of golden promise that suggested either a perfect day or spectacular chaos. Charles Henderson III woke up in the guest room feeling like he'd been used as a crash test dummy for agricultural equipment. But for the first time since arriving in Montana, he was actually looking forward to the day ahead. The past 3 days had transformed him from a walking disaster into something resembling a functional ranch hand. More importantly, they'd given him and Sarah May time to discover that beneath all the family pressure and arranged marriage nonsense, they actually enjoyed each other's company. Charles was tying his boots, real work boots now, not Italian leather disasters, when he heard voices drifting up from the kitchen. One belonged to Thomas Wilson, the other was unmistakably Buck Martinez, and he sounded like a man on a mission. "Now, see here, Thomas," Buck was saying in his most reasonable tone, which Charles recognized as a warning sign. "I've been watching you test my boy Charles all week, and I think it's time we had ourselves a little chat about fairness." "Your boy?" Thomas's voice carried amusement and challenge in equal measure. "Last I checked, Buck Martinez. You work for the Henderson family, not the other way around." "That's where you're wrong, partner. I work for what's right." "And what's right is giving those two kids a chance to figure out their own feelings, without you orchestrating every blessed thing that happens to them." Charles crept to the top of the stairs, fascinated by this confrontation between two master manipulators. "Charles has proven himself plenty," Buck continued. "Boy's been knocked down more times than a bowling pin, and he keeps getting back up with a smile." "What more do you need to see?" "I need to see if he can handle real ranch work without someone holding his hand," Thomas replied stubbornly. "Today's the final test. We're moving the cattle from the north pasture to the south. If he can help with a real cattle drive without falling off his horse or getting trampled, then maybe I'll consider him worthy of my daughter." "Cattle drive, huh?" Buck's voice took on that dangerous, cheerful tone that meant he was planning something spectacular. "Well, Thomas, that sounds like a fine idea. Of course, I hope you're ready for some real competition." "What do you mean?" "I mean, if you're going to test Charles, it's only fair that Charles gets to test you right back. See if you're worthy of having him as a son-in-law." The kitchen fell silent. Charles could practically hear Thomas Wilson's brain processing this unexpected challenge. "You suggesting a competition?" Thomas asked slowly. "I'm suggesting we make this interesting. You and Charles, head-to-head cattle drive. Winner gets to decide how this engagement moves forward. You win, Charles proves himself on your terms. Charles wins, you back off, and let these kids figure out their own path." "And what makes you think Charles Henderson III can outwork a man who's been ranching for 40 years? "Because," Buck said with unmistakable pride, "I trained him." Charles felt a surge of warmth at Buck's confidence, but also a healthy dose of terror. He'd never been on a cattle drive in his life. Hell, he'd never successfully ridden a horse without falling off. "Deal," Thomas said, "but we do this right. Real cattle, real distance, real ranch work. No shortcuts, no special treatment. Wouldn't have it any other way." Charles quietly made his way downstairs, trying to look like he hadn't been eavesdropping. In the kitchen, Buck and Thomas were shaking hands like two gunslingers agreeing to a duel at high noon. "Morning, Charles," Buck said casually. "Sleep well. Like a baby. A very bruised, hay-covered baby." Charles poured himself coffee, noting the tension in the room. "What's going on?" "Just planning today's activities," Thomas said with a grin that suggested Charles was about to face his biggest challenge yet. "Hope you're ready for some real ranch work. As ready as someone can be after 3 days of agricultural boot camp." Sarah May chose that moment to enter the kitchen, and Charles felt his heart do that little skip that had been happening more frequently over the past few days. She was wearing her work clothes, practical jeans, a flannel shirt, and boots that had seen real use, but somehow she made the ensemble look effortlessly beautiful. "Good morning, everyone," she said, then paused as she noticed the charged atmosphere. "Okay, what are you three plotting now?" "Cattle drive," Thomas announced. "Charles here is going to help move our herd from the north pasture to the south. Real cowboy work." Sarah May's eyes widened. "Dad, Charles has never—" "Now hold on, sweetheart," Buck interrupted smoothly. "Don't go underestimating our boy here. He's tougher than he looks." Charles appreciated Buck's confidence, even if he didn't entirely share it. "How many cattle are we talking about?" "About 200 head," Thomas said, watching Charles's face carefully for signs of panic. 200? Charles swallowed hard. "That's a lot of cattle." "Sure is. Course, if you're not up for it, we could always call the whole thing off. Maybe you could go back to the city where things are nice and safe." Charles recognized the challenge for what it was. One final test to see if he would back down when things got serious. But something had changed in him over the past few days. Maybe it was all the agricultural humiliation he'd survived. Or maybe it was the way Sarah May was looking at him with concern and hope in equal measure. "When do we start?" Charles asked. Thomas's grin widened with respect. "Right after breakfast. Buck, You better hope you know what you're doing. Thomas, Buck said with supreme confidence, I always know what I'm doing. What Thomas didn't know was that Buck had spent the previous evening giving Charles an intensive crash course in basic horsemanship and cattle handling. What Charles didn't know was that Buck had also spent considerable time planning a few strategic surprises that would level the playing field between a lifetime rancher and a 3-day agricultural student. An hour later, Charles found himself mounted on a horse named Patience, a name that suggested either optimism or irony, facing down 200 cattle who looked like they had their own opinions about being moved anywhere. Remember what I taught you, Buck murmured as he adjusted Charles's stirrups. Stay calm, trust your horse, and don't try to be a hero. Patience knows what she's doing even if you don't. What if the cattle don't cooperate? Cattle are like rich people. They mostly want to do what they're already doing. Your job is to convince them that moving was their idea in the first place. Sarah May rode up on her own horse, looking every inch the experienced rancher she was. You sure about this? She asked Charles quietly. Absolutely not, but I'm doing it anyway. That might be the most honest thing anyone's said all week. Thomas Wilson mounted his horse with the easy grace of someone who'd been doing this since childhood. All right, everyone. Charles, you take the left flank. Sarah May, you've got the right. I'll handle the lead, and Buck can bring up the rear. Why does Buck get the easy job? Charles asked. Because, Buck said with a mysterious smile, someone needs to make sure nothing goes wrong. What Thomas didn't see was Buck discreetly signaling to 3 of the ranch hands, who immediately began implementing what Buck privately called Operation Cattle Chaos, a carefully orchestrated series of minor disasters designed to test Thomas's legendary calm under pressure. The cattle drive began smoothly enough. The herd moved in a generally southward direction, guided by 4 riders who knew what they were doing and 1 rider who was faking it with increasing confidence. Charles discovered that Patience really did know her job, and as long as he didn't interfere too much, they made a decent team. Not bad for a city boy, Thomas called out after the first mile. Maybe there's hope for you yet. That's when Buck's first surprise kicked in. One of the ranch hands, following Buck's explicit instructions, had strategically loosened a gate latch on a side pasture. As the main herd passed by, the gate swung open, revealing a dozen excited young bulls who'd been waiting all morning for something interesting to happen. Oh snap! The ranch hand called out in perfectly fake surprise. The bulls are loose! Thomas spun his horse around, immediately shifting into crisis management mode. Sarah May, keep the main herd moving. Charles, help me round up those bulls before they scatter. Charles felt a moment of pure panic as a dozen energetic bulls decided to treat the situation like a jailbreak party. But then Patience seemed to sense his uncertainty and took charge, positioning herself exactly where she needed to be to help guide the rogue cattle back toward their proper pasture. That's it! Buck called out encouragingly. Trust your horse. She's got this. For 10 chaotic minutes, Charles found himself actually participating in authentic cowboy work, riding, shouting, and somehow managing to help corral the escaped bulls without falling off his horse or getting trampled. When the last bull was safely back in his proper pasture, Charles was breathing hard but grinning with genuine accomplishment. Well, I'll be damned, Thomas said, looking at Charles with new respect. That was some decent riding. Thanks, Charles said, still slightly amazed that he'd survived. Though I think Patience deserves most of the credit. Good horse is worth her weight in gold, Thomas agreed. But it takes a good rider to let the horse do her job. What Thomas didn't notice was Buck's satisfied smile. The bull escape had been perfectly timed to show Charles at his best while putting Thomas in a situation where he had to rely on his future son-in-law's help. They resumed the cattle drive, and Charles was starting to think he might actually survive the day when Buck's second surprise made its appearance. This time, it was the weather. Buck had checked the forecast obsessively and knew that afternoon thunderstorms were practically guaranteed. What he'd done was strategically position the group so that when the storms hit, they'd be at exactly the right spot for maximum dramatic effect. The first rumble of thunder sent the cattle into nervous motion. Dark clouds gathered with the speed of divine disapproval, and the air took on that electric charge that suggested nature was about to make a statement. "Storm's coming in fast," Sarah May called out. "We need to get them to shelter." "There's an old barn about half a mile ahead," Thomas shouted over the increasing wind. "We can wait it out there." That's when the real challenge began. Moving 200 nervous cattle toward shelter while lightning crackled overhead required every bit of skill, teamwork, and sheer stubbornness they could muster. Charles found himself riding harder than he'd ever ridden in his life, shouting directions to cattle who seemed determined to scatter in all directions. But something magical happened in that chaos. Charles stopped thinking about proving himself and started thinking about the job that needed to be done. He and Sarah May worked together with the kind of seamless coordination that comes from shared purpose. Even Thomas began treating him like a partner rather than a test subject. When they finally got the herd safely to the barn just as the storm unleashed its full fury, all 4 riders were soaked, exhausted, and oddly exhilarated. Now that, Thomas said, dismounting in the shelter of the barn, was some real ranch work. It was incredible, Charles said, still catching his breath. I mean, terrifying and chaotic, but incredible. Welcome to ranch life, Sarah May said, and the way she smiled at him made Charles's heart race faster than the cattle drive had. Buck, meanwhile, was feeling exceptionally pleased with himself. His weather timing had been perfect, creating exactly the kind of shared challenge that brought people together. But he had one more surprise up his sleeve, the biggest one yet. As they waited for the storm to pass, Buck cleared his throat in that particular way that meant he had something important to say. "Thomas," he began, "I think it's time we had ourselves an honest conversation." "About what?" "About this whole arranged marriage business. About testing Charles and manipulating these kids instead of letting them make their own choices." Thomas bristled. "I'm protecting my daughter's future. You're trying to control it. There's a difference." Buck's voice was gentle but firm. "I've been watching Charles grow up for 15 years. And I've been watching you and Sarah May for the past week. You want to know what I see? Enlighten me. I see 2 young people who are perfect for each other, but who need the space to figure that out for themselves. And I see 2 stubborn fathers who are so busy protecting their kids that they're forgetting to trust them." Charles and Sarah May exchanged glances. This conversation felt bigger than just the cattle drive. "Charles," Buck continued, "your daddy sent you up here to marry Sarah May because it made good business sense. But you know what? Sometimes the best business decisions are the ones made with your heart instead of your calculator." "What are you saying, Buck?" "I'm saying, stop letting other people write your story. You're not your father, and you don't have to live his life. If you want to marry Sarah May, marry her because you love her, not because it's what's expected. And if I don't want to marry her, then don't. But make that choice based on who she really is, not on some idea about arranged marriages and family obligations." Buck turned to Sarah May. "And you, young lady, stop assuming that every man who shows interest is either after your money or trying to control your life. Some of us are actually worth the risk. I never said you didn't have to. It's written all over your face every time you look at Charles like he's going to disappoint you." Buck's voice softened. "Sweetheart, he's been knocked down by every animal on this ranch, soaked by broken plumbing, covered in mud and hay, and he's still here. What more proof do you need that he's not going anywhere?" The barn fell silent, except for the rain drumming on the roof and the occasional snort from a resting horse. "Thomas," Buck said finally, "Charles has proven himself 6 ways from Sunday. The boy's got character, he's got heart, and he's got enough stubborn pride to survive being married to your equally stubborn daughter. What more do you want?" Thomas looked at Charles, really looked at him, and saw not the pampered, rich boy who'd arrived 3 days ago, but a young man who'd earned his respect through sheer determination and good humor in the face of agricultural adversity. "You really want to marry my daughter?" Thomas asked directly. Charles felt every eye in the barn focused on him. This was the moment of truth, not just for Thomas's approval, but for his own future. "Sir," Charles said carefully, 3 days ago, I would have said I was here because I had no choice. But now I'd like the chance to find out if Sarah May and I could build something real together. Not because our fathers arranged it, but because we choose it." "And if she doesn't choose you?" Charles looked at Sarah May, seeing in her face the same uncertainty and hope he felt in his own heart. "Then I'll respect that decision and be grateful for the chance to know her." Thomas nodded slowly. "Sarah May, what do you think?" Sarah May felt the weight of everyone's expectations, but more importantly, she felt the possibility of her own choice. Charles Henderson III wasn't the man she'd imagined marrying, but he also wasn't the spoiled prince she'd expected to meet. "I think," she said carefully, That maybe we should stop treating marriage like a business merger and start treating it like, well, like a marriage. Meaning what, exactly? Her father asked. Meaning Charles and I should have the chance to court each other properly, without tests, without sabotage, without family pressure. Just two people getting to know each other and seeing if we're compatible. Buck beamed like a proud grandfather. Now that's what I'm talking about. So, Thomas said, processing this unexpected turn of events, you want to call off the engagement? No, Charles said, surprising everyone, including himself. I want to earn it. Sarah May felt her heart skip. What do you mean? I want to court you the right way. I want to take you on real dates, learn what makes you laugh, discover what you're passionate about beyond ranching. I want to fall in love with you properly, if you'll let me. And if I don't fall in love with you back, then we'll figure that out together. But at least we'll know we gave it an honest try. The storm outside was beginning to clear, sending shafts of sunlight through the barn windows. Sarah May studied Charles's face, mud-streaked, honest, and completely different from the polished businessman who'd arrived at her ranch 3 days ago. Okay, she said finally, but I have conditions. Name them. First, no more family interference. We do this our way, at our own pace. Agreed. Second, you have to actually learn ranch work, not as a test, but because if you're going to be part of this family, you need to understand this life. I'd like nothing better. And third, Sarah May paused, then smiled. You have to let me teach you how to handle Henrietta without getting pecked. Charles laughed, a real genuine laugh that filled the barn with warmth. Deal, but I'm going to need a lot of practice. Good thing I'm a patient teacher. Buck wiped what was definitely not a tear from his eye. Well, I'd say this cattle drive was a complete success. The cattle are still in the north pasture, Thomas pointed out. The cattle were never the point, Thomas. The point was getting these two kids to stop fighting what they both wanted. As the storm cleared, and they prepared to finish moving the herd, Charles Henderson III realized that somewhere between the bull encounter and the hay baler explosion, between the attacked chickens and the cattle drive, he'd found something he hadn't been looking for. He'd found himself. And maybe, just maybe, he'd found love too. Sarah May Wilson, watching Charles mount patience with newfound confidence, realized that sometimes the best surprises came disguised as the worst problems. Her father's arranged marriage had brought her a man she never would have met otherwise, someone who challenged her assumptions and made her laugh even when he was covered in agricultural disasters. Buck Martinez, riding drag behind the herd as they finally completed their journey to the south pasture, felt the deep satisfaction of a job well done. Sometimes the best way to help people fall in love was to get out of their way, but sometimes it took a little creative sabotage to help them see what was right in front of them. 3 months later, the Wilson Ranch hosted the wedding of the decade, a celebration that brought together Montana ranchers and East Coast elite in a blend of cowboy boots and designer dresses that somehow worked perfectly. Charles Henderson III married Sarah May Wilson not because their fathers had arranged it, but because they'd chosen each other through mud, chaos, agricultural disasters, and the kind of authentic courtship that Buck Martinez would tell stories about for years to come. And if their wedding cake happened to be decorated with tiny fondant figures of a bull, a chicken, and a hay baler, well, that was just Buck's way of making sure they never forgot how their love story really began. Sometimes the best adventures start with the worst ideas, and sometimes, if you're very lucky, they end with exactly what you never knew you were looking for: the end.